Carl Jung discovered something that most therapists avoid telling their patients. He observed that children raised by narcissistic parents don't just suffer. They become narcissists themselves, not by choice, not just through trauma, but through something far more invisible and terrifying, unconscious mimicry. The child looks at the cold, distant father and learns that emotion is weakness. The child watches the manipulative mother and internalizes that love is control. And then, decades later, you look in the mirror and you see exactly what you swore you'd never become, your parents. The question isn't if this happened to you. The question is, when will you have the courage to acknowledge it? There's a psychological truth that Jung revealed, and it's going to shake everything you believe about your personality. We spend our entire lives thinking we're who we choose to be, that our decisions are our own, that our way of loving, reacting, and feeling is authentic. But Jung showed that a large part of what we call me isn't really me at all. It's automated imitation of our parents. He called it identification with the parental complex. And when your parents are narcissists, you don't just learn to survive them, you learn to be them. The pain I'm going to explore here isn't the obvious pain of abuse. It's the existential pain of discovering that your entire personality might be an unconscious copy of the people who hurt you. That cold way of reacting when someone cries near you isn't yours. It's your dad's. That need to control everything in a relationship isn't protection. It's your mom acting through you, that you're not being authentic. You're performing a script recorded in childhood. And the worst part, you're probably teaching the same thing to your kids. Right now, without realizing it, the cycle doesn't stop. It replicates generation after generation until someone has the courage to look at the truth and say, I've become exactly what destroyed me, and I need to stop this. I'm going to show you how this works, how narcissism is taught, word by word, gesture by gesture, look by look, how children absorb the emotional coldness of their parents as if it were oxygen, how narcissistic patterns are transmitted not through DNA, but through unconscious behavioral modeling. And most importantly, I'm going to reveal the Jungian mechanism that explains why you replicate exactly the behaviors that hurt you the most. But before I continue, I need you to prepare yourself, because recognizing that you've become your narcissistic parents is one of the most painful truths there is. Many people prefer to deny it forever, to continue believing that they're different, that they escaped, that they broke the cycle. But if you have the courage to really look, if you have the courage to confront the possibility that you're repeating exactly what you suffered, this video can be the beginning of your real individuation, the separation between who you truly are and who you were programmed to be. So, take a deep breath, because what's coming now is going to sting. Ethan was 37 years old when it hit him. He was in the car with his 6-year-old daughter, Lily. She had spilled juice on the seat. A normal kid accident. And out of nowhere, Ethan heard his own voice saying, "You never pay attention to anything, do you? Look at this mess you've made. I can't believe how careless you are." The little girl started to cry. And in that moment, Ethan saw two things at once. His daughter shrinking in the seat, exactly as he shrank as a child. And his own voice. It wasn't his voice, it was his father's voice. The tone, the words, the coldness, all identical. He stopped the car, apologized to Lily, but when he got home, Ethan couldn't stop thinking, how many times had he spoken that way? How many times had he used exactly the same phrases that his father used with him? And the question that scared him the most, am I just like him? Ethan grew up with a classic narcissistic dad, critical, cold, emotionally absent. When Ethan cried as a child, his father said, "Man up, don't cry." When Ethan got a good grade, His father didn't praise him. He just demanded a better grade next time. When Ethan tried to show him a drawing, his father barely looked. "Okay, that's great, now let me work." His entire childhood was like that. Constant emotional invalidation, coldness, criticism disguised as education. Ethan suffered a lot. Spent years in therapy trying to heal the wound of never having been seen by his father, and swore to himself, "I will never be like that with my children. I'll be different." But he wasn't. He was exactly the same. Not all the time. Not in an obvious way. Ethan didn't yell, didn't hit, didn't curse. But the coldness was there. The criticism was there. The emotional invalidation was there. Disguised. Subtle, but present. And Ethan only realized it when he saw his daughter shrink in the car seat. What happened to Ethan is what Jung tried to explain his entire life. Children don't just learn from what their parents say. They learn from what their parents are, from how their parents react, from what their parents behaviorally model every day. And when a child grows up observing a narcissistic parent, they absorb those patterns automatically, unconsciously, not because they want to, but because that's how the child's brain works. Imitation. Jung called this identification with the parental complex. The child doesn't just suffer from the father's complex. They incorporate the father's complex, internalize it, and then, years later, without realizing it, begins to act exactly as the father acted, even if they hate the father, even if they swore they'd never be like him, because the pattern was recorded so deeply, so early that it became automatic. And here's the part that's most terrifying. You don't realize when you're doing it. To you, it seems natural. It seems like it's just you being you. You don't think, now I'm going to be cold like my father was. No, you just react with coldness. And you think it's your way, your personality, but it's not. It's programming. Ethan started to pay attention, and the more he paid attention, the more examples he found. The way he demanded perfection from his wife. The way he invalidated Lily's emotions. The way he was always too busy to really listen, all just like his father. He hadn't inherited the DNA of narcissism. He had inherited the behavior, and behavior you can change. If you have awareness. Ethan scheduled therapy. The therapist asked, "Do you remember specific moments from childhood where you learned to be this way?" Ethan started to remember. 7 years old, crying because the dog died. His father said, "Stop crying. Death is part of life. You need to be strong." Lesson learned. Emotion is weakness. 10 years old, got a 95% on a test. His father, "What about the other 5%? Lesson, nothing you do is enough. 12 years old, problem at school. His father, "Solve it yourself. You're old enough." Lesson, your problems don't matter. It wasn't isolated traumatic events. It was the repetition, day after day, constant behavioral modeling, Ethan's brain, absorbing, internalizing, recording, until those patterns became automatic. Carl Jung said that the unconscious imitates, and when you're a child, the unconscious mainly imitates your parents, because they're the most present figures, the most important, the most observed. The child has no choice. They don't consciously decide, "I'm going to copy my narcissistic dad." No, their unconscious absorbs the patterns, and decades later, they emerge without warning, without control. And here's the most painful paradox. The more you hate your narcissistic dad, the more you risk becoming him. Why? Because hatred is fixation. You become obsessed with the person you hate. You think about them all the time. You replay their behaviors, and unintentionally, you etch those patterns even deeper. Jung explained this through the concept of the shadow. Everything you reject in another person, but don't consciously integrate, goes into the shadow. And the shadow acts on its own. So you reject your dad's coldness. You say, "I'll never be that cold." But you don't integrate that coldness. You don't look at it consciously. You don't understand how it works. And then the coldness goes into the shadow and acts through you without you even realizing it. Ethan was living exactly that. He had spent years rejecting his dad, saying, "I'm different. I'm not like that." But he had never looked inside, never asked, "Where is my dad's coldness within me? How does it act through me? In what moments do I replicate the patterns I suffered?" Because it's easy to see the narcissism in others. It's difficult to see it in yourself. The therapist asked Ethan to do an exercise, to write down all the phrases his dad used to say to him in childhood, and then to observe how many of those phrases he said to his own children. Ethan spent a week doing this, and he was shocked. Out of the 23 phrases he listed, he used 17 regularly, with Lily and his eldest son, Michael. "You never pay attention. You're careless. You need to be more responsible. I don't have time for this right now. Stop complaining. That's not a reason to cry. You're exaggerating. You need to be strong. I do everything for you, and you don't appreciate it. Look at the trouble you cause me. I can't believe you did that again. How many times do I have to tell you? You never learn. Why can't you be like your brother? You're embarrassing me. Grow up. Stop being so dramatic." Each phrase was a copy, word for word, tone for tone, and Ethan hadn't realized it, because when you grow up hearing these phrases, they become part of your internal language. You don't even question it. You just repeat it. And here's something that few therapists explain. Repetition creates identity. You repeat a narcissistic behavior once, it's a mistake. You repeat it 10 times, it's a pattern. You repeat it 1,000 times, it's who you are. It becomes your personality, your way of being. And you forget that you learned it. You think you were born this way, but no one is born a narcissist. Narcissism is taught. Gesture by gesture, word by word, look by look. Ethan observed not only the words, but the gestures, rolling his eyes when someone complains, sighing impatiently when interrupted, looking away when someone cries, all copied from his dad. Invisible but lethal micro-behaviors. They create the emotional environment. The child doesn't understand words, but perfectly understands the look of disdain and internalizes. "My emotions are a bother. I need to disappear." The child grows up and does the exact same thing with their own children. Generational cycle, same coldness, same narcissism, transmitted not through genetics, but through unconscious modeling. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Ethan was living that. He thought it was just his way. Personality, temperament, fate, but it wasn't. It was the unconscious acting. Patterns engraved in childhood, unintegrated paternal complex. And the scariest part, Lily, his 6-year-old daughter, was already starting to replicate the same patterns. She had a doll, and Ethan heard her talking to the doll exactly the way he talked to her. "You never pay attention to anything. Look at this mess you've made." 6 years old, and she was already learning, already recording the patterns, already preparing to become the next in the generational line of transmission of narcissism. The chain needs to be broken, but it doesn't break on its own. It breaks with consciousness, with confrontation, with the courage to look at yourself and recognize, "I've become what I swore I'd never be, and I need to change that now." Hold on, because before we continue, I need to show you something that will connect all of this. Jung discovered that there are three specific forms of identification with the narcissistic parental complex, and each one creates a different type of narcissism in the adult. If you understand which form acted on you, you'll be able to see exactly how you're replicating your parents' patterns and where you need to focus to break the cycle. But this requires looking at something you've probably been avoiding your whole life. The first form Jung identified was total identification. The child merges completely with the narcissism of the dad. There's no separation. Becomes an identical copy. Thinks, reacts, feels the same, or rather, doesn't feel the same. This usually happens when the child is the same gender as the narcissistic dad and has no alternative model. Ethan was in this category. His entire emotional structure was a replica: coldness, criticism, control, all copied. Total identification doesn't mean you like your dad. You may hate him, you may have cut off contact, but that doesn't change anything. Identification is unconscious. The patterns act through you regardless of how you feel. You spend your life saying, "I'll never be like him." And yet, you're exactly like him, because the identification happened when you were 3, 4, 5 years old, when your brain was a pure sponge. Jung insisted, you can't de-identify without first identifying. You need to consciously recognize how and where you became your dad. Name it, see it. Only then can you separate. Ethan made lists, phrases, gestures, patterns, all conscious, and every time he saw a pattern, he thought, this isn't mine, this is his, I can choose differently. It seems simple, but it's one of the most difficult processes, because it requires you to destroy the image of yourself, to admit, I'm not who I thought I was, I'm a construction, an imitation, and I need to deconstruct to rebuild something authentic. The second form of identification is defensive identification. This is when the child becomes narcissistic, not through fusion, but through defense. They observe the narcissistic dad and think unconsciously, if I'm like him, I won't suffer what I suffer now. If I'm cold, no one will hurt me. If I'm critical, no one will criticize me first. If I'm powerful, no one will control me. This identification, it's far more subtle than a direct copy. It's adaptation. The child picks up on the narcissistic traits of their dad and uses them as armor, as protection. They don't want to be like their dad, but they develop the exact same behaviors because they believe it'll protect them. Carl Jung called this identification with the aggressor, and it's one of the most common defenses in narcissistic families. The child who's constantly criticized becomes critical. The child who is constantly controlled becomes controlling. The child who never receives empathy becomes incapable of giving empathy. Not because they're evil, not because they want to, but because their brain has learned the world is dangerous. People hurt you. The only way to survive is to be stronger, colder, more powerful than others. And the only reference they have for strength, coldness, and power is the narcissistic dad. So, they mimic. Not out of love, not out of admiration, but out of psychological survival. Ethan recognized this too. Part of his coldness wasn't just copying, it was defense. He'd learned early on, if you show emotion, you'll be ridiculed. So he buried his emotions, built a cold persona, and believed that was strength. But it wasn't. It was fear, disguised as strength. Vulnerability disguised as invulnerability. Defensive narcissism. And here's the problem. Defensive narcissism seems to work. In the short term, you genuinely become less vulnerable. People don't hurt you as much. You have control. You have power. But in the long run, you lose something essential. You lose connection. You lose intimacy. You lose the ability to love and be loved truly, because love requires vulnerability, and you killed vulnerability to survive. So you live, but you don't live fully. You function, but you don't feel. You relate, but you don't truly connect. And deep down, in a very deep part of your psyche that you don't consciously access, you know that you're replicating exactly what destroyed you, and you're destroying the people around you in the same way. The third form is fragmented identification. The child develops an internal division. One part incorporates the narcissism of their dad, another rejects it violently. Two parts in constant war. Jung called it splitting of the self. The child internalizes two contradictory selves, one that acts like the narcissistic dad, another that hates the narcissistic dad, and they alternate without control. One day, the person is empathetic, present, loving. The next day, they're cold, critical, distant. They don't understand why. It's automatic. Fragmented identification at work. Ethan saw this in his wife Lily. She grew up with a narcissistic mom. One moment, the most loving mom in the world, patient, validating. The next moment, she'd explode, scream, criticize, just like the mom she hated. Then came the guilt, shame, despair. Lily would cry, "I've become my mother. I swore I'd never be like this. But it's automatic. I can't control it." You don't control it. The fragmentation happened unconsciously as a child. The child's mind couldn't process contradictory realities. Dad, loving sometimes, cruel others. So it split, created two internal models. Now the two fight for control. Recovery is different. It needs to integrate fragments. Recognize that both selves are you, loving and cold, empathetic and narcissistic. Learn to consciously choose which self acts in each moment. Jung called this the transcendent function, holding opposites in consciousness at the same time, and choosing a third path, not being totally cold like Dad, nor totally the opposite. Finding your own path, your own center, your true self. And here's the turning point that changes everything. Ethan had been in therapy for 6 months, working on identification with his narcissistic dad, making lists, recognizing patterns. But he still hadn't changed much. He understood it intellectually, but he wasn't changing behaviorally, until the therapist said something that stopped Ethan in his tracks. "You won't be able to stop being like your dad until you forgive your dad." Ethan was furious. Forgive? The man who destroyed me, the man who never saw me, the man who turned my childhood into an emotional hell? Never. And the therapist explained, forgiveness here isn't approval. It isn't saying that everything was okay. It isn't reconciliation. Jungian forgiveness is something else. It's recognizing that your dad was also a wounded child, that he also had a narcissistic dad, that he was also programmed, that he replicated what he suffered, and that he probably wasn't even conscious of what he was doing. This doesn't justify it, but it explains it, and explanation allows separation. As long as you only hate your dad, you're trapped to him. Emotionally, psychologically, energetically. Hate is a chain, and as long as you're chained to him, you'll continue replicating his patterns, because you haven't been able to separate. Forgiveness is cutting the chain. It's saying, you were a broken person who broke another person, and this chain needs to stop. I'm not going to carry you inside me anymore. I won't let your shadow act through me. I separate myself, I individuate, and I choose to be different. Ethan resisted for weeks, but eventually he did the exercise the therapist asked for, writing a letter to his dad, not to send, just to process. And in the letter, Ethan wrote something that changed everything. Dad, I understand now. You also had a cruel dad. You were also a child who was never seen. You also suffered, and you did the best you could with the emotional resources you had. The problem is, your resources were zero. You were empty, and empty can't give anything. I spent 30 years hating you, and in those 30 years, I became you, without realizing it, because hate is fixation. And fixation is repetition. So today I choose something else. I choose to see you as a broken human being, not as a monster, and I choose to separate myself from you. I don't forgive you because you deserve it. I forgive you because I deserve it. I deserve to stop carrying you inside me. I deserve to be myself, and not a copy of you. When Ethan finished writing, something changed. It wasn't magic. It wasn't instantaneous, but it was real. He felt, for the first time in his life, that he wasn't his dad, that he could be something else, another person, himself. And then the real work began, the work of reconstructing an authentic self, a self that was neither a copy of his dad, nor a reaction against his dad, but something new, something his own. This is the process that Jung called individuation, and it's the only real way to break the generational transmission of narcissism. As long as you're trapped in identification or in rejection of parental narcissism, you remain inside the system. You're defined by your dad, either by imitation or by opposition, but it's still him who defines you. Individuation is leaving the system. It's saying, my dad was this. I don't need to be this, nor do I need to be the opposite of this. I can be something entirely different, something that comes from within me, from my true self, not from programming. Ethan started small, very small. Lily spilled her juice. Again. And for the first time, before reacting automatically, Ethan paused, took a breath, and asked himself, what do I really feel right now? Not what my dad felt, not what my dad would say. What do I feel? And he realized he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel frustration. He felt compassion. Lily was a 6-year-old kid. Accidents happen. It was normal. It was human. So Ethan said something he'd never said before. It's okay, sweetheart. It was an accident. Let's clean it up together. Lily looked at him, surprised, and smiled, and Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Connection, real connection. Not performative, not automatic, real. And he realized that was the difference. When you act based on the patterns of a narcissistic parent, you perform. You're on autopilot. When you act from your true self, you connect. You are present. You are alive. Sounds simple, but it isn't. Because decades of programming don't unravel with one pause and one breath. They unravel with 1,000 pauses, 1,000 breaths, 1,000 conscious choices, day after day, situation after situation, until the new pattern becomes as automatic as the old one. But this time, it's your pattern, not theirs. I'm going to give you something now, something that can change your life if you really use it. You've just seen how narcissism is transmitted generation after generation through unconscious mimicry of narcissistic parents. You saw how Ethan discovered he'd become the dad he hated, and how he started to separate, started to individuate. A concept, by the way, that Carl Jung emphasized throughout his career. This truth that I've shared here isn't known by most people, because most videos about narcissism focus only on the trauma, on how narcissistic parents hurt. But few have the courage to talk about the most painful part, that you've probably become them and are teaching the same thing to your children. Making this kind of content is hard because it's not popular. People want to hear that they're victims, They don't want to hear that they're also perpetrators. But if I only told you what you want to hear, I'd just be another one in the line of superficial channels that sell cheap emotional comfort. I choose the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it hurts, because it's the truth that transforms. And if this video touched on something real inside of you, if you recognized patterns that you're replicating, if you want to help spread this awareness to other people who are also trapped in the unconscious repetition of narcissism, the super thanks button down there is the way to do it. It's not just financial support, it's you saying, this truth needs to be known. And I want to be part of breaking the cycle of generational narcissism. You're not just a spectator, you're someone who's confronting their own shadow. And that's rare, that's courageous, and that deserves to be supported. But getting back to it, Ethan continued the process. And the more he practiced the conscious pause, the more he realized. The patterns were in everything. In the way he reacted when his wife cried. In the way he demanded perfection from himself. In the way he judged the people around him. Everything was an echo of his dad. Everything was programming, and recognizing that was, at the same time, the most painful and most liberating thing in his life. Painful because he needed to accept that he'd lost years being an imitation, that he'd hurt people he loved, that he'd transmitted to Lily and Ethan Jr. the same patterns that destroyed him. The guilt was enormous. The shame was enormous, but it was also liberating. Because for the first time, Ethan understood. It wasn't his fault. He hadn't chosen to become his dad. He'd been programmed, automatized. And now that he had awareness, he could make different choices. He could be different. He could break the cycle. And here's something fundamental that Carl Jung tried to teach. Awareness doesn't guarantee change, but change without awareness is impossible. You need to first see the patterns, recognize them, name them. Only after that can you change. So if you're watching this and recognizing patterns in yourself, don't drown in guilt. Guilt paralyzes. Use guilt as information, as a sign that something needs to change. And then choose change. Small, gradual, but real. Ethan did this for a year. And at the end of that year, Lily said something that broke him. "Daddy, you've changed. You're nicer now." And Ethan asked, "How so, sweetheart?" And Lily responded, "You listen now. Before, you didn't listen." 6 years old, and she'd noticed. Children always notice. They don't have the words, but they notice, they feel, and they internalize. And Ethan realized, if he'd continued on autopilot, Lily would have grown up with an emotionally absent dad, would have suffered the same wound that he suffered, would have developed the same defense mechanisms, would have replicated the same patterns in the next generation. The chain would continue infinitely, but he stopped, gained awareness, did the work and broke the chain. Lily will still have wounds, because no parent is perfect, but she won't have this wound. She won't have the wound of a dad who replicates unconscious narcissism. And that's everything, because when you break the cycle in yourself, you break the cycle for all future generations. Your children, the children of your children, the children of the children of your children. The chain stops. Now, in you. And here's the final part that Carl Jung always insisted on. Individuation isn't an event, it's a process. You don't wake up one day individuated. You practice individuation day after day, situation after situation, choice after choice. There will be days when you relapse. You'll react on autopilot. You'll say the phrase your dad said. You'll make the gesture your dad made. And that's okay. It's not failure. It's a process. What matters isn't never relapsing. What matters is noticing when you relapse, recognizing it, and choosing differently next time. Ethan relapsed multiple times. There were days when he was cold with Lily. There were days when he invalidated emotions. There were days when he demanded perfection. But the difference is that now he noticed, apologized, explained to Lily. "Daddy reacted badly. It wasn't your fault. It's a pattern I'm still working on." And you know what happened? Lily learned something new. She learned that adults make mistakes, that making mistakes is human, that what's important isn't being perfect, but recognizing the mistake and trying to fix it. She learned emotional responsibility, something that Ethan never learned from his own dad. So even the mistakes became teaching. Even the relapses became an opportunity to model something new, something healthy, something real. And that's the hope. It doesn't matter how many years you've spent replicating the patterns of your narcissistic parent. It doesn't matter how much damage you've already caused. You can stop. Today. Now. In this moment, you can gain awareness. You can do the work. You can individuate. It all starts with the courage to ask yourself what Carl Jung would ask. What are you truly feeling, and how can you become more fully yourself? And you can break the cycle. Your kids will notice. Your partners will notice. You will notice. Because the difference between living on autopilot and living consciously is the difference between merely surviving and truly being alive. So, here's the challenge. If you've recognized narcissistic patterns in yourself during this video, do the exercise that Ethan's therapist asked him to do. Write down the phrases that your narcissistic dad or mom said to you the most often during your childhood, and then during the next week. Observe how many of those phrases you say to your children, to your partner, to yourself. Don't judge yourself, just observe, acknowledge, write them down, and then choose one phrase to change. Just one. Don't try to change everything at once. Choose the most toxic phrase on the list and commit that phrase never again. And whenever you start to say it, pause, breathe, and choose something else. It might seem small, but small changes create huge transformations because patterns are made of repetitions. Change one repetition, and you start to change the pattern. Change the pattern, and you start to change who you are. And remember, you're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing this for all future generations. You are being the person brave enough to say, the cycle stops here, with me, now. This isn't a small thing. This is everything. So comment below. Which of these toxic phrases did you hear the most in childhood and still repeat today? Write it in the comments, not out of shame, but out of awareness. Because when you name it, you take away its power. And when you share it, you help other people recognize their own patterns. How many of you here have recognized that you've become exactly what you swore you'd never be? Let's create collective awareness.